Welcome to ARI Live. I'm Chris Hopstock, Architect Education Specialist here at Black Spectacles and your host for ARI Live. Today we're going to be joined by guest expert Kat Hurd, who's going to be walking through what to do on your site visit and a few other related CE topics. If you think of any questions you'd like to ask Kat during the Q&A, make sure to post them in the Q&A box on the right side here. There will also be a page in our ARI community after the episode if you think of more questions after the broadcast. On our next ARI Live on August 17th, 2023, we'll be doing an overview of building codes. You can go to go.blackspectacles.com/podcast to sign up. To learn more about the study materials Black Spectacles offers or to watch this episode again later, go to go.blackspectacles.com. Kat's going to be sharing her screen during today's live, so we really recommend watching the webinar to better see how we work through the material. With that, I'd like to say welcome to today's guest, Kat Hurd. In addition to working with us here at Black Spectacles, Kat is also a licensed architect in Washington, and she's based in Seattle, working with MG2, and she's a member of the AIA Seattle Code Committee. So welcome back, Kat.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. I feel like my intros get nerdier and nerdier each time. Yes, as Chris said, I sit on the AIA Code Committee. I do some volunteering with NCARB as well, and my day job is working at MG2 in their retail commercial studio.
Lovely. So I guess let's jump into it.
Okay, that sounds great. Let's see, just making sure. There we go. Great. So, yeah, like Chris said, let's just go ahead and jump in. So, question number one. An architect is preparing to attend the pre construction conference for an 18-story multifamily building. The contract for construction notes a 24-month duration. After reviewing the agenda for the meeting, the architect notes that one of the agenda items is to discuss the frequency and scope of the architect's site visits. Which of the following is true of the architect's site visits during construction? Check the three that apply. Okay, so the first things that are jumping out to me in this question, we've got our 18-story multifamily building. That's a pretty big building. Contract notes, 24-month duration. Not sure if that's going to be relevant yet. Architect notes one of the agenda items is to discuss the frequency and scope of the architect's visits. So immediately, what I start thinking is, okay, as far as site visits go, what do the AIA contracts typically tell us? So let's go ahead and look at our answer options and see what we're working with. So first, the architect should make at least one site visit per month. Because the question doesn't specify anything in the contract that determines the minimum or required number of site visits for the project, I'm not loving this answer. Most contracts, including the AIA A201, require the architect to make site visits at appropriate intervals. Because this answer specifies one visit per month, I'm going to go ahead and say this is not a good answer. Next, the architect should visit the site at intervals appropriate to the stage of construction. Yes, this is a great one. This is more appropriate wording and the type of wording that I would expect from contract documents, so I'm definitely going to leave this as an option. The architect should issue site inspection reports after each visit. The wording here is a little tricky. We want to make sure, as the architect, to issue field or observation notes after site visits, but the architect does not and should not inspect on visits except at substantial and final completion. So, because of that, this option is out. The architect should keep the owner informed about the progress of the work. This seems reasonable to me. The owner or owner's rep may also make site visits, but given that we don't have the contract documents to reference, we can't be sure. I'll leave this as an answer choice unless I feel more strongly about the other answers. The architect should approve the current status of construction at the conclusion of each field visit. So, this is language that I'm not super familiar with, the approve the current status of construction. The architect's responsibility on site is to review the current work for conformance with the contract documents, not to approve construction unless specified in the contract or as part of a submittal. So, because of that, I'm going to say this one is no good. And then finally, the architect's field observations are to determine if the work is generally in conformance with the CDs. This one is definitely correct, like I stated in the answer before. So, based on that, I would say the answer choice of, let's see, 2, 4, and 6 look correct to me. See? Bam, there we go. So yeah, like I said, the answers we chose were correct. This is fairly standard contract information that we should all be familiar with, both for our ARE exams, but also just in the field in general. The correct answers do align with the AIA contract documents and seem to be pretty standard industry wide.
Thanks for that, Kat. Yeah, this is a good intro question to really what we're talking about today, site visits. And I like this question because it's a pretty typical ARE question where the answer really lies in the AIA contract documents that you should assume are being used on any question that you see on the ARE. But nothing in this question is really mentions the B101 or the A201 or anything like that. So you've really got to be familiar with those documents in order to be able to answer a question like this. Um, I will say that in practice, it's pretty commonplace that your agreement with a client is going to spell out a number of site visits you expect to make. But that's not the way the B101 is laid out. The B101 talks about site visits, generally to determine if the work is in conformance, which is one of these answers, and at intervals appropriate to the stage of construction. And it also gives a length that the construction is expected to take. So there's not a specific place to list how many site visits you're going to be making, although in practice, like I said, usually the architect will spell that out. Usually the client wants them to spell that out. And it's a good, just a good practice, I think, because if you go over that number of site visits, you then have a good case for some additional service fees. So I just one other thing I wanted to say about the questions today. We often get feedback that the questions that we're going over take more than 2.5 minutes to answer on this podcast. That's really just because we're going at length to explain them. I think this question is a pretty typical ARE question that in the heat of the moment during the ARE, if when you're sitting down and taking the exam, you can answer this type of a question in 2.5 minutes for sure. So with that, let's move on to question two, I guess.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I definitely agree with you, Chris. And I think something to note is if you got this question as part of a case study, then you may actually have the contract where it does list out the site visits. So, that's just something to be aware of.
Yeah, that is a great point. I think if this was a case study question, I would definitely look at the documents that are provided because I think in a case study, it's fair game that that contract might say something like I was explaining before, where you've actually spelled out a number of site visits that you're going to make. So great point.
And with that, let's go on to question number 2. During a recent site visit, the architect is approached by the tiling subcontractor who states that the bathroom that they're working on was framed 6 inches larger than the interior elevations and plans show. Therefore, they need a revised tiling layout. Which of the following are appropriate responses from the architect? Check the 3 that apply. All right, let's go ahead and just look at our options straight off here. So, first, sketch a revised tiling layout in the field so the tiling subcontractor can proceed. So this is an option, but it's not my favorite one because it doesn't allow the architect to review how this revised layout is going to affect the budget or if plumbing will be affected since it looks like a bathroom. So I will leave this as an option for now because it is an option, but it's not my favorite one. Next, discuss reframing the bathroom with the GC so that the dimensions comply with the CDs. I really like this option because of the wording. Discuss doesn't imply a change will be made immediately, but it does allow both parties to review the issue and suggest possible solutions and cost ramifications. So because of the wording, I will go ahead and leave this as an option. If it said direct the GC to change the framing, then I might be a little more shaky, but discuss is a very reasonable option to me. Next is prepare an additional service request for the revisions to the bathroom tiling layout. This is a good option. Because will be additional materials required to complete the bathroom tiling layout, the budget will be affected. This is a reasonable way to address the additional cost. Next is going to be instruct the carpenters on site to reframe the bathroom to comply with CDs. This is a strong no for me. The architect should never be instructing subs or contractors on site. And even if that was an appropriate thing to do, there are budget and time factors to consider before potentially pulling subs off one task for another. Next is tell the tiling subcontractor to follow the CDs for design intent, regardless of the dimensional discrepancy. This one just doesn't really make sense to me. It feels similar to walking into an independent coffee shop and saying, just set it up like a Starbucks. There's a reason the tiling sub is asking for clarification. The architect should also review the layout to determine if the tiling start point will be affected, how many additional tiles will be required, if the tiles need to be cut on site now, and more. So, because of all of that, I would say this is not a good option. And then finally, note the issue in their field observation report. Yes, definitely. This is a prime example of something that should be mentioned in a field observation report. Any issue that does come up on site, in addition to just, general things talked about, status of construction, we definitely want to make sure any issues or discrepancies are noted. So based on our available options, I'm going to go ahead and strike out option one since the remaining three options are stronger. Perfect. So, like we worked through, here are our three correct answers. This is a good example of keeping some options as a choice, but being aware that there may be stronger answers to choose from. Answer choice one isn't necessarily wrong, but there are definitely more correct answers available to us.
Yeah, I really appreciate you picking up on and explaining the nuance of the wording in this question. I think the sort of the first word in each answer choice is super important here. I would say for choice four, like you were mentioning, anytime you see the word instruct on the CE exam or when it's talking about contractors or subcontractors, you can almost not read the rest of the answer choice. You should never your answer should never include the word instruct when it's talking about um, contractors or subcontractors. You can instruct if you're the project manager, you can instruct the designers on the project to do something, but architects otherwise never instruct people from outside of the firm. Um, I think choice one is kind of like you said, Kat, interesting. We're probably both guilty, and many of us here are probably guilty of doing this. I've never done this for a revised tiling layout for a lot of the reasons you mentioned, that it probably has a ripple effect. Like this wall moved 6 inches, so some room somewhere else got 6 inches smaller. So what does that mean? It's probably something you want to study at the office. But I've definitely done some sketching in the field to keep the work going, and I think occasionally that's acceptable in real life. Probably you should be skeptical of that answer choice on the ARE. I'll also say that number one doesn't mention anything about the general contractor. If you're going to be sketching a revised tiling layout, the general contract, you really need to give that to the general contractor, and have them give it to the subcontractor. It's kind of the same reason that number four is incorrect. One kind of feels like you're instructing the subcontractor on how to do their work. Um,
Yeah, that's a really good point, Chris. And I didn't even catch that it was just telling the subcontractor and leaving the GC out of it. That's a really good thing that you picked up on, and definitely, we definitely want to be, putting any instructions or sketches through the GC, not just straight to the subs.
Definitely. And while we're on this question, Kat, we've got a question here in the notes. Somebody's asking, does the additional service request mean a change order, or is that an additional fee for the architect? If you want to just field that one. Um,
Yeah, sure. So let's see. Do the additional services request mean change order or additional fee for the architect? I'm a little shaky on my ad service knowledge just because all firms do this a little bit differently, but I believe that it's not technically a change order. Chris, maybe you can speak a little more to this one.
yeah, I've heard architects in practice refer to their request for more money as a change order. I think that's a messy way of describing it, and that we should always use the term change.
Yeah, sorry, we lost you for a second there, Chris. Now we've got
Micron
you twice.
Oh, well, I'll just ignore that. My Chrome just shut down, so here I am.
Oh dear. Well, I'm
Um,
glad it wasn't just me. I was afraid that I was just sitting here and everyone else was moving along.
all right, we've got some no audio comments. If you're able to hear us now, if somebody could just mention that. Oh, sound should be fixed now. Can I get a confirmation that the sound's fixed now? Good,
All
great.
good.
Perfect. So what I was saying is that I've heard architects use the term change order to refer to their services, and I think that's messy. I think the term change order should be reserved for changes to the construction contract when either the cost of the construction, or the duration of the construction are being changed. That's the way that term is used in all of the AIA documents, and it's the way that it is going to be used on the ARE. An additional service request is simply a proposal that an architect would send to their client, the owner, requesting additional funds for them to do some work that was not contemplated by the original agreement, such as in this case, redesigning because the contractor put a wall in the wrong place. Somebody here in the comments said that maybe you shouldn't prepare the additional service request immediately. You should talk to the owner and GC about it first. I would say you should talk to the owner about it first. The GC is kind of not included in doesn't have to be included in that discussion because you're really just asking the owner for more money. The GC doesn't have anything to do with it. Choice 3 doesn't say anything about immediately or imply a timeline. The question simply just asks which is an appropriate response from the architect, which I take to mean at some point in response to this situation.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for walking through that with us, Chris. This I feel like is another great reason why it's great to work in an office with more than one person. An example of I might not know the exact definition of ad serve off the top of my head, but that's why we've got Chris around because he can jump in and help.
Yeah, I've heard them called ASRs, additional service requests, but that just might be like I don't know, a New York City thing. So it's and I don't think there's a specific ARE term for that. So I wouldn't get hung up on that specific language. But we're really in that choice. We're talking about the architect requesting additional design fees. So I think we can move on to question 3.
That sounds great. And finally, just a straightforward multiple choice question. And I believe that we are going to be throwing up a poll here pretty soon so that you guys can go ahead and throw in your answer choice. I apologize if that does not come through. That is the intent. But as you saw, we're having a couple technical difficulties. So just to keep moving, I'm going to go ahead and go through this, and hopefully you guys can submit your answers as well. So, like I said, finally, multiple choice. Check all that apply can be very daunting. So it's nice to get some straightforward questions in the mix. That said, reading this is not the easiest question we've had so far. So let's just go ahead and jump in. During the construction of a new restaurant, the owner decides that they want to add an additional restroom to the plans, utilizing space that was intended to be table and chair storage in the contract documents. The contractor prepared documentation noting that the additional bathroom will cost $22,500 and will require an additional 2 weeks of time to be added to the schedule. The owner disagrees and thinks that the revision should cost at most $15,000 and that no additional time is warranted because the bathroom is not on the project's critical path. The architect agrees with the owner. How should the change be documented? So, a few things immediately jump out of the question at me. First, there will be an additional cost. Even if we don't totally agree on what that cost is, more money is required. The timeline is potentially in question. Again, there is a disagreement, but that could happen. And then finally, there is not a consensus between all parties on how to proceed. So, based on that, let's review our answer choices. We have change order, construction change directive, minor change in the work, and undocumented since the parties don't agree. Proceed to meditation. Wow, mediation. So, immediately I'm going to strike out answers 3 and 4. I disagree that this is a minor change in the work, as it costs thousands of dollars and potentially affects the overall project timeline. That feels more than minor. The change definitely needs to be documented as well, even if it's as a sketch, field observation, or other, just to note the request. Mediation also feels like too big of a step at this stage, and the AI contract documents do list the architect as the initial decision maker for things like this, so I don't think this is a good answer either. So that's going to leave us with change order and construction change directive. It's important to know the difference between the two. Simply put, a change order, also known as a CO, has all parties, the architect, owner, and contractor, sign a document agreeing to the change. A construction change directive, CCD, is instructions to the contractor from the owner and architect, as they are the only ones to sign the document. Because of that, I would go ahead and select construction change directive as our answer. Excellent. The architect should document the change through a CCD or construction change directive. Now, this doesn't mean that the contractor just has to do the work without any extra cost or time, but the decision has been documented, and now the GC can make more of a case for the additional resources or time that they think they need, and that allows the architect to then, take a closer look and review that. If the GC feels like they are not properly compensated for this additional work, then they can move to a more formal legal means of resolution. But for now, I think the CCD is the perfect way forward.
Yeah, and this is just such a classic ARI question, partially because I could write sort of an infinite number of questions with the same question and four answer choices here, just changing the scenario, and they're all unique questions. So it's really important to be familiar with these three ways of changing the contract for construction, and the situations in which you would use each one. It's also really important when you're answering a question like this to just be seeking the specific information. This question's kind of long, right? So you want to seek the specific information that would lead you down one answer choice path or another. So does this change the contract sum or time? Yes or no? And then part two is, does everybody agree on how much it changes one of those things? If the answer is yes, and that line of questioning will lead you to the answer to this type of question 100% of the time. I think some of the wording in this question is a little bit filler language, and it's meant to it's going to take some time for you to read. But I think if you get this question and you're specifically looking for those couple of facts, and you understand the difference between change orders, CCDs, and minor changes in the work, you will be able to answer this pretty confidently every time. Um, I appreciate, Kat, what you were saying about the last answer choice. And quite frankly, you might see this as a multiple choice with just three options. That's a question type on the ARE. For this one, it was hard. I wrote this question and it was hard to come up with the fourth answer choice. So I came up with this one. It definitely sticks out like a sore thumb. And it could trip you up if you don't understand that construction change directives are used when the parties don't agree. You might think that, how can I change the construction contract if we don't all agree? So like this should go to dispute resolution. That kind of makes sense, I guess, logically, but it's just not the way that the AA contracts and the suite of documents work. So it's not the correct answer. And super excited to see many of you get the correct answer here in the comments. I think we're gonna do a poll for one more of these, and oh, we also got 23 votes on the poll. So on the next one, if you could just answer on the poll and not in the comments, just so that other folks don't see your answer, that we'd appreciate that. So, oh, we've got a question here. Why not a change order? Kat, you want to explain a little bit about why change order is not right here?
Yeah, sure. So, kind of like I talked about, a change order, it has all three parties agreeing. So, the architect, owner, and contractor have to agree to the what the additional cost is going to be and any additional timeline. Um, I think that, in reality, there would be a lot more conversation on site or through OACs between these three parties before they just, slapped a change order or CCD. But because of the way the question is written, what we really need to focus on here is that the owner disagrees with the contractor and that the architect agrees with the owner. So, based on those context clues, the CCD is going to be our best way forward. Because, again, Only the owner and architect need to agree to issue a construction change directive versus the change order, which needs all parties to come to an agreement before issuing the change.
Yeah, definitely. I think you can also, if you take a look at these AIA documents for change order and minor and construction change directive specifically, go down to the bottom and look at the signature lines. On a change order, the three parties are going to sign that change order. That implies, you're only going to sign something if you agree with it. So that implies that all three parties, owner, architect, contractor, agree with the change order. And on a CCD, construction change directive, there's a line for the architect to sign and a line for the owner to sign, but not the contractor. That implies that we don't need the contractor to agree with this. It's also in the wording of it, the word directive, like somebody's being directed to do something. In this case, that's the contractor. So yeah, just a little, if this was a case study question and those documents were provided and you didn't know the answer, you could try to look for a clue like that.
Definitely. And I wanted to just touch on something that you said a little earlier on about this question, saying there is kind of a lot of fluff in the question. We look at it and we just see this block of text. When I was testing, I was all about the highlight and strikeout tool. This would be a great example of if, as you're reading, just highlight the things that are jumping out to you. That way, when you're looking at the actual question of how should the change be documented, you can then go back up and just see those highlighted portions, the parts of the question that are really important and will inform your answer. That's a really good way of breaking down these big blocks of text, which can feel overwhelming sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. Appreciate the test taking tips always. Let's move on to number 4. We had some more questions on this, but we're going to handle those in the Q&A portion of this at the end.
That sounds good. Whew, we are facing a few difficult questions here. This one, it's never fun to disagree with the contractor or any member of your team, particularly when it involves money. So let's go ahead and just read through this. An architect reviewed a submittal for a variety of masonry accessories and marked the submittals as no exceptions taken. During a site visit a few months later, the architect notices that non galvanized brick anchors are being used, contrary to the contract documents. The architect notes it in their field report and requests that the contractor replace the brick ties. The contractor responds that the brick ties that they installed are in accordance with the approved submittal. Therefore, they require additional time and money in order to comply with the architect's request. How should the architect respond? So I believe that we do have a poll going for this one. And if we don't, it should be popping up pretty shortly here. So let's go ahead and look at our answer choices. Prepare a construction change directive. So this is an option, though a CCD typically is issued for a change in the contract documents or construction, and the architect is asking the GC to comply with the original documents. So this would be an atypical response to the issue, but it technically is an option because something will need to be changed, even if it is to get it back to where it should have been originally. So we'll keep this, but we'll see if there are stronger options out there. Number 2 is issue a minor change in the work. Like the last question, this to me does not feel like a minor change. AIA A201 defines minor change as a change which does not involve adjustment of the contract sum or extension of contract time. The GC mentioned this change would do both, so this answer is out. Direct the masonry subcontractor to replace the ties. Like some of our earlier question, the architect's job is not to instruct subs on site. So because of that, this answer choice is incorrect. And then finally, inform the contractor that submittals don't relieve them of their duty to comply with the CDs. This seems like the best answer we have. When an architect reviews a submittal, they are typically reviewing for design intent only. No exceptions taken is a common phrase listed on submittal stamps instead of approved to help mitigate risk and liability. Using this language means the architect doesn't have any comments for the items within the submittal, but it also doesn't relieve the contractor of providing products that do comply with the contract documents. So, yeah, that is our correct answer. And I know this one is an unpopular answer and it may feel a little unfair and like the architect is trying to use legalese to cover themselves. And to be honest, that is partly true, but that's also what submittals are. In an ideal world, we as architects could submit our documents to a GC and they could build off our drawings with no questions asked. But sometimes products are discontinued or something is omitted from the drawings. So, realistically, everyone makes mistakes. The same thing happens on the contractor side. No building will ever be perfect to the millimeter, and that's to be expected. Submittals are a double check that the GC or subcontractor has correctly read the contract documents and specifications. Sometimes a portion of a submittal may slip through the cracks, and the architect will mark it as no exceptions taken. But realistically, it is still the responsibility of the GC or sub to ensure that they've correctly interpreted the contract documents and read the specifications.
Yeah, I think this is a common situation. I think I've had it happen to me. I'm sure many people have had it happen to them, where there's kind of a disconnect of the everybody's understanding of what a submittal means and what the architect's quote unquote approval of that submittal means. This is a really good topic to cover at the pre-construction conference and make sure it's included in the notes from that conference, because you can always just point back to that and say, we talked about this. I don't approve things. I mark that they're generally in compliance with the contract documents. And to make sure that you're all on the same page about the purpose of submittals. I think some contractors might view submittals as sort of cumbersome, and why do I need them if I have the architect's drawings? Why can't I just build off them? But it's a really important process that is used for the contractor to show that they know what the architect is looking for, and for everybody to get on the same page about that. It's also a really important process because the architect, when they're doing the design intent drawings, the contract documents, you don't know, for instance, what cabinet shop is going to be making the custom kitchen cabinet. So you don't know their shop standards, their capabilities. It would be pretty ridiculous for you to do shop drawing level drawings in your CDs, because everybody's going to have a little bit of a different way of creating things, and that's important for you to allow for that flexibility. So I kind of always like to explain the purpose of submittals that way to contractors, and I think that it shows that you're not trying to dictate how they do their job. You're trying to allow for some flexibility in the design so that they can build things the way that they know how to best. And I think when I've explained it that way, I think it's gotten a better response than I don't know, I don't want the liability and that type of a response. I think it creates a better rapport. And then on the first two, like Kat was saying, first two answer choices here, like Kat was saying, this isn't technically a change. That's another place where there could be a disagreement in the definition of the word change. I think the contractor probably views the word change to mean anytime I need to physically change something that I've already done, that's a change. But in the world of AIA documents and the family of agreements, a change is when the architect and or owner are asking for something to be built differently from what is in the contract documents. That's the only time there's a change. If the contractor built it incorrectly the first time and you're asking them to build it correctly, that is not, in my opinion, a change. I think,
Yeah, that's a really good point that you made about the submittals, Chris. And I admit, even as the architect, I at a certain point in my career was like, "Pff, why are we doing submittals? They should read the documents and be correct." But as a classic measure once, cut twice kind of person, boy, am I glad we have those submittals. It just, it's that extra level of double checking. And like this question says, sometimes items do slip through, but boy, a lot more would be slipping through without those submittals.
yeah, agree completely. You've got to embrace the submittal process. We're not going to get away from it, and it's an important process, I think, in construction. So embrace it. I know, reviewing them for months and months on end is can feel cumbersome at times, but it's an important process. And you'll definitely see questions about it on the ARI. So
For sure.
yeah, let's head on to the last question here, and then we'll
All
do some
right.
Q&A.
That sounds great. All right. So our final question, and because this is a check all that apply, we're not going to have a poll up for this one. So, just follow along, and I guess you can put your answers in the chat if you want, or you can just keep them in your head, either way. An architect receives the following request for information from the contractor. Several downlights and two speakers at the lobby corridor cannot be installed according to the CDs because of conflicts with the mechanical ductwork above. Please advise on the Please advise on alternate locations for the lighting. The mechanical ductwork is already installed, and the owner is interested in finding a cost-effective solution that maintains the original design intent of the space. Which of the following consultants should the architect consult in order to respond to the RFI? Check the four that apply. So before we do jump into the answer choices, just a testing strategy that I want to touch on here. When we have 5 or 6 answers and we are being asked to check a majority, if we're not totally sure about which ones are correct, a really strong strategy is just look for the two that are incorrect. Sometimes that's easier to figure out what's incorrect than correct. So just something to keep in your mind, as you move forward in your testing. But let's just go ahead and go over our answer choices as they sit. So first we've got the mechanical engineer. Because the question does state that the ductwork is already installed, I'm not sure if the mechanical engineer really needs to be involved at this point, but I will leave them as an option. I don't think that, reworking any of the ductwork is really that cost-effective solution that the owner is looking for, but again, potentially. Next, we've got the lighting designer, and I would say yes. Because the lights are being moved, the lighting designer should be consulted. A lighting designer is also not a typical consultant, at least that I use on my projects. So when I see something like a lighting designer, that to me says, okay, this may be a little higher design than I'm used to working with. So if you have a lighting designer on your project and you're touching the lights, you should probably rope them in. So I'm going to say yes to lighting designer. Next, we have the electrical engineer. And this one, we could go back and forth on. So, in my mind, yes, if the lights are being moved, we need to ensure that the electrical engineer is roped in. We don't know how much the lights are being moved. The question doesn't tell us. We don't know if they're being, an inch to the right or left. Maybe we don't need to consult them because that's sort of something we can change in field, but we don't know if these are having to go, 2 feet right or left. So because of that, we do need to ensure that the current electrical layout can support whatever new lighting and speaker locations and that no additional load or routing is needed. And then also the electrical engineer is also going to need to update their drawings to reflect the updated lighting and speaker layout. So because of that, I would say, yep, electrical engineer is a good option. Next, we've got the interior designer. And this one is kind of iffy for me. While I wouldn't typically consult an interior designer on lighting locations, as long as the lighting designer is involved, it does make sense to loop in the interior designer to ensure any furniture in this lobby area is correctly lit. So I think because of the way the question is worded, that yeah, it might make sense to loop them in as well. Next, we've got our audio visual consultant. I would say definitely we want to involve AV. If we're moving the speakers, that's audio, and the lights, that's visual, they should definitely be consulted. So that one is a definite yes. And then finally, we've got the owner's representative. Again, this one is a maybe. The owner did ask the architect to find a solution that maintains the original design intent of the space. So it sounds like they do trust the architect, but they also may want to review the design for final approval. This isn't necessarily a strong option, but it is an option. So, based on the choices that we do have, all of them could be involved, but I think our strongest options are that lighting designer, electrical engineer, interior designer, and AV consultant. So, like we kind of walked through, those are our correct answers. As I said, the mechanical engineer and the owner's rep might want to be involved, but again, there are stronger options out there.
Yeah, I just want to answer one question that we just got here. That's when you're taking the exam, do you get partial credit on a question like this? The answer is no. There's no partial credit on the check all questions, which is definitely super frustrating, but they are all or nothing in terms of how many points you get. So If you, I guess the test taking strategy there is if you're pretty unsure about a select all that apply question, um, and you're on your first pass through the exam, I would move past it. I wouldn't spend too much time on it because the if you're sort of guessing, the chance of you getting it correct is just so much lower than a multiple choice question. And then fill in the blank questions are even worse. Guessing is pretty challenging on a fill in the blank question. So just wanted to get that out of the way. A couple of things about this question. I like to tell people to think about the person who's writing the question when they're trying to answer this. So the reason I say that for this one is why is the information provided here that the owner's interested in finding a cost-effective solution that maintains the design intent? That information's probably included because it affects one of your answer choices. And in this case, when I wrote this, I included that to make the mechanical engineer an incorrect answer. So what you should read into that is that the mechanical ductwork is going to be a lot more expensive to move than moving around some lighting and some speakers. And it's definitely, of the two choices, move the ductwork or move the lights or the speakers, it's the more expensive option. So when you see that we're looking for a cost-effective solution, that should make you think no mechanical engineer involved here. And then the owner's representative, I saw that a number of people included that in their answer choice. I can understand why. I think on a technical note, the question's asking which consultants should the architect consult with in order to respond to the RFI. An owner's rep is not a consultant. But in practical matters, I think the four correct answer choices here are more correct than the owner's representative. I've worked with owner's representatives, and I've actually been an owner's representative in my life. I would have wanted to be included in this type of a discussion, but I don't think that I don't think that that's the normal course of things. And it also, in this question, sounds like the owner's rep, like Kat said, already provided their input. So just wanted to point that out.
I did notice a couple things coming up in the chat, and someone did bring up a good point. I think it was Kyle. He said, you know, the RFI only states, please advise on alternate locations for the lighting. So his question was, why are we even mentioning the speakers? And so for something like that, I would say, it does say several downlights and two speakers cannot be installed. So it is possible that alternate locations for those speakers have already been determined or they figured out a solution in the field. Either way, if the speakers are going to be moving and we as the architect are unclear on where exactly those are going, all the information we have is the speakers can't be installed. Even if the GC is only asking about the lighting, I would still want to rope in our AV consultant and say, hey, there's an issue with the speakers. Did you already figure that out? If so, great. We'll document it in our drawings. We'll get that information to the engineers so that so that all the drawings are, on the same page, so to speak. That's a poor pun. They're not on the same page. They are coordinated and make sense.
Yeah, that is a good catch though, Kyle. I appreciate that he is reading the question really thoroughly and thinking about the type of thing like that. I think if you've answered RFIs, you'll know that sometimes they're not the most eloquently worded things. The fact that it does include the speaker somewhere in the question, even though the question statement, I guess itself, doesn't include the word speaker, I would, like Kat said, still loop in the AV consultant, and you could loop them in and ask simply like, were the speakers already figured out? Like, and if they were, why wasn't I included in that discussion? That type of thing. But I think if you learn that there's an issue with the speakers, regardless of the actual wording of the question here, you should talk to the AV consultants about that. So let's see. We can answer a couple of questions here in the Q&A, and if anybody thinks of any more, the Q&A is just right below the chat on the far right of your screen, and it's the little question bubble thing with the question mark in it. So if you want to ask questions there, feel free to do so. Kat, somebody's asking, this is related to one of the middle questions. I don't remember the exact number, but what's the end result of the CCD? Like, how does it eventually get resolved once everybody figures themselves out, I guess, and understands what they want?
Sure. Yeah. Chris, this is one of those ones where I've worked in a few different offices, and I think that those end up in different ways. At my current office, a CCD, I don't believe that it does turn into a change order, but you might have more information on, based on the AIA documents. Does that CCD end up into a change order? It was my understanding that these were kind of separate things.
Yeah, I think there's definitely different ways you can handle it in real practice. In terms of the AIA documents, um, once a CCD is agreed on by the contractor, it you would memorialize that by creating a change order, and I think that makes logical sense because the only difference between a CCD and a change order is whether or not the contractor agrees. So once they do agree, you've got sort of a different situation. Um, in my experience, the way it works is you document the CCD at the time to have a record of this and to also get the contractor to perform the work. And then sometime around the date of substantial completion, final completion, sort of in the project closed out, there's generally a meeting of the minds, and there's, in my experience, a number of outstanding things like this where um, the change order, not sorry, the contractor thinks they're owed a certain amount of money, and the owner thinks they're owed a certain amount of money, and they kind of negotiate and make all the change orders and CCDs, go away, and they figure out a final payment that works for everyone. So that's my experience with it. But I think for the purposes of the ARE, I would think about it as once the contractor agrees, you will document that with a change order.
Yeah, I appreciate you walking us through that. I think this also highlights why the pass rates for exams are the greatest roughly 2 to 3 years into your field experience. Because I have worked at a number of firms and I've been in the field for about 10 years now, I would have to probably relearn or unlearn some of the things that I've picked up at work because they're not standard, right? They are specific to my firm. So I appreciate you walking us through that from the in-carb perspective.
Yeah, and that's going to be a real challenge if you are taking these exams and you have a good amount of experience with the CA phase of a project. I mean, I worked in New York City on residential buildings where we used non-AAA contracts. Every project I ever worked on was a non-AAA contract. So I wasn't familiar with it. I was familiar with very different processes going into my examination. So that's why it's important. I think our content does a great job of summarizing the requirements of those documents. So if you're watching our videos, I think you've got a strong starting point to understand these things. But you should definitely also read the contracts. I know they're super boring and long and legally worded and kind of hard to follow. But you've got it'll make you a better architect, not just make you able to pass the exam. I think learning to embrace that and wrap your head around what those contracts actually say. Um, Really, the answers to so many questions are in those documents. So I would focus on.
Totally. Yeah, and I definitely agree with that. And for those who are like me that look at those contracts and go, I'm just going to read the same paragraph over and over and not much is going to stick. What I did when I was studying is I kind of created like a matrix to compare these contracts. If A happens, who is at fault? If B happens, who's paying out that money? And that was a really good way to force myself to kind of critically read those contracts without just reading it all the way through and not retaining a bunch of information.
Yeah. Let's see. We've got a question from Lords just asking, can you explain again what a submittal is? So, Kat,
Yeah.
what's your elevator pitch on submittals?
Oh boy. So a submittal is a more thoroughly, well, it can be one of a few things. So I'm thinking of a casework submittal versus a paint submittal. Let's start with the easier one, which would be paint. I specify a Sherwin-Williams blue paint. That blue paint is going to be manufactured in a few different places. So that blue may look a little different in one location than another location. So what a paint submittal look for us is going to look like is I'm going to say, use robin's egg blue And then the GC says, great, I got a can of the paint. Here's an example. They'll actually physically paint a piece of paper and they will send that to us or give it to us so we can physically look at it and say, okay, here's the control of like what came in the little book that says this is what it's supposed to look like, and now this is what this is what was actually mixed up in the field. A lot of the time it's pretty close, but there are some times where the colors are way off, and so we want to see what the actual color is going to be. A really common mistake that gets made is in white paints, and I think, anyone who has done any sort of finish or paint work, you know that there are 1,000 different types of white. Who knew? But whites can be very green or very yellow. It's hard to get that kind of pure white to exactly the shade. So it's going to allow us to get a double check. And let's say the shade is off. We send it back and we say, hey, you know, have your painter try again. This is too green. This is too purple. It's too whatever color. And you'll go back and forth until that shade looks correct. So that is one type of submittal. Another type is something like a casework submittal that Chris talked about a little bit earlier. And when we are building or when we are drawing casework, we are taking our best guess at how that casework is going to go together. We say, hey, we want the countertop to be 24 inches. We want it 8 feet long. We want these drawers, these cabinets. But then that's going to go to a shop where they say, okay, we actually make casework and we know a little bit more of what we're doing. So they're going to design down to probably the 16th of an inch, and they're going to give you very specific drawings back. And then our job at that point as the architect is we look at those drawings and we say, okay, this does match the design intent of this space. Maybe that countertop is 24 inches and 1/16th of an inch larger because of whatever reason. For me, I'm going to say that's fine unless it's a code issue. But typically, we're not looking to say, this cabinet should have been 3 feet wide. It's 2 feet 11 inches and 7/8 of an inch, that's close enough. But they know the actual fractions of an inch to actually build those things so that it works within the overall cabinetry. So the submittals are, in one way, a double check that what we specified is going to be on site or built properly. But in another way, it can be supplemental instructions to the contractor on how to build things on site.
Yeah, that's a great example with the millwork. Often, in my experience, millwork is built overseas, and therefore you'll get the shop drawings in millimeters and in metric. So that 16th of an inch discrepancy is a real thing. And I think when it comes to that, you've got to review specifically for accessibility requirements. If your example there was a 30-inch cabinet being 29 and 7/8 instead of 30, that might be a problem if that cabinet is your clear floor space under a sink or at a workspace. But if it's 36, like you said, probably not a problem that it's 35 and 15/16. So that's the type of thing you don't want to be so prescriptive on the 16th of an inch dimension when you're reviewing submittals. But if that's where experience, understanding your design intent and what parts of your design intent are like code minimums really comes into play. Let's see here. We've got a question. What's the difference between submittals that you're talking about, like cabinets versus shop drawings? And that's an important one. There are a number of different types of submittals. Submittal is an umbrella term. Shop drawings are a type of submittal. The other types are product data and samples, like Kat was describing with the paint. I think mock-ups are often considered to be submittals at some point. Kat, can you think of any other types of submittals you might receive?
Yeah, I am currently doing CA on two projects right now, and so I am in a sea of submittals. I have a box with papers stacked about that thick with paint samples. We'll get tile samples, but I think you kind of did run through most of them. Every now and again, we'll get like test results as part of a
Mhm.
submittal
Good
if
one.
something needs to comply. I think that's maybe the only other one that I can think of. But I think realistically, anything could be a submittal. Like anything in your drawings that you're telling the GC, like, hey, this is kind of tricky. We're not sure how this is going to work out. You can request some type of submittal before it's installed, whether that is a mock-up or shop drawings or product data. It's a submittal, I think, is pretty much anything that the architect can use to double check to make sure that, you know what, yep, it meets the design intent. We're good to go.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, so submittals are the architect determines what submittals are required for a project because in your specs or on your drawings, you're going to list out, usually in the specs for a large project like the ones that are covered on the area, it's going to be in the specs. You'll list all of the required submittals in that specification, and it could be any of the things that we just talked about, but that's how the contractor knows what types of submittals you're looking for. So really the first step in reviewing a submittal is looking at the spec for that product or assembly and determining, did I even ask for this to be submitted? And if the answer is yes, then you go ahead and review it. You'll find often, not often, but sometimes the answer is no. And then I would suggest, think about it. Did you miss something that really you should review? If that's the case, I think you should review it. Or is it something that you really shouldn't be getting your hands on? Is it a scaffolding submittal that the contractor, I've had that happen where the contractor really wanted the structural engineer to verify that the structure could handle the loads that were going to be imposed on it by actually a hoist, not scaffolding. Kind of a valid question, but not the structural engineer's purview. It's really the general contractor has to get an independent engineer to do that because that's their means and methods. It's not going to be part of the project at the end of the day. So the design team should not be involved in its design. Let's see. So we've got this question. After a submittal is chosen and approved, does it now become a change order or one after it is chosen? Kat, maybe talk about maybe explain again what a change order is and
Yeah.
how that might apply to submittals and might not.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if maybe part of the question is, let's say there was a submittal for, like, let's go back to the question that talked about the galvanized ties. I think I might be maybe a little bit later. Yeah, the non-galvanized brick anchors that are being used. So let's say that in the submittal, um, they had said, hey, the actual galvanized ties have been discontinued. So what now? And at that point, instead of issuing a change order for those ties, what's more likely going to happen is a substitution request will be submitted. And a substitution request would happen when there is a specific product specified, or let's say, for this tile, you can use one of these three manufacturers, but they're all on back order or have gone out of business, something has happened where you can't use that specific manufacturer, then the contractor says, hey, I did a little bit of my own research. I found this tile contractor that it's the exact same or it's a little bit different. Here are the differences. They're going to list any change in cost, any change in the appearance or the install. All the changes will be on that substitution request that then the architect and sometimes the owner will review and sign. So I wouldn't say that it's, a different product and a submittal is a change order, but I guess there could be situations where you would turn it into a change order. I think that would depend on the way the project is run and the way that the contract is actually set up. Some clients are okay with substitution requests. Others would prefer to see it for, I don't know, maybe for billing or just maintenance as a change order, but I think the substitution request is a little more typical.
Yeah, I agree. And we had a follow-up question kind of along those lines saying, if the submittal called out non-galvanized and the spec said galvanized, should it have been a substitution request? And the answer is yes. And I can't think of a situation where you should approve that substitution request either because you should
Yes.
be using galvanized or stainless steel brick ties for corrosion resistance. But yeah, I think if you get back to the purpose of submittals being for the contractor to show you, the architect, and the rest of the design team that they understand and how to build this thing according to the design intent, theoretically, nothing they submit should ever result in a change order because they're not supposed to be submitting things that change the documents. Now, in real life, things happen, but But they really should be documented as a substitution request. So, if I got the submittal and I was operating under the AAA contracts, I would probably return, and I noticed the difference, which I would hope that I did. I would return it as rejected and say, if you want to submit this brick tie, you've got to submit it as a substitution request. Here's a hint. I'm not going to approve that anyway because it's got to be galvanized. So why don't you just submit the galvanized thing? I would say that in a much nicer way, but that's the way I would probably handle that. Kat, you have time for one more? What do you think?
Sure. Yeah,
Cool.
I can do one more. I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. It looks like we might go a couple minutes over, so I hope that's okay with everyone.
Yeah, let's do it. So, this is kind of off topic, but I figured we'll answer it anyway. Where did it go? I just saw it. Oh, my question is about coordinating with owner-hired consultants. What's the deal with owner-hired consultants? Is it a supplemental service or a basic service? Do you have any experience with that, Kat?
Yes, I do. In retail, that is something that happens fairly frequently. A lot of the retail projects that I've worked on we have our own design staff and we do the architectural drawings, but a lot of the time the owner has their own interior designer or design team as well that wants a lot of input, which is fair because they're the ones fronting the money for these projects. So I think that it's going to depend on your exact contract layout, who's reporting to who, what strings are actually being attached. But typically, what we would do, depending on the owner, is we would either have meetings set up to review things with the owner's rep with the owner present, or if the owner feels comfortable, we may just bypass them if they don't need to be included on everything and they are acting as an agent or representative for the owner. Um, then we might just go to them directly. But if it is a consultant that answers to the owner, we typically like the owner there on the calls with them or included in the email. Let's say that the owner hired their own interior designer as a consultant, and we get a fabric submittal to look at fabrics on chairs in a lobby. What we're going to do is we will, as the architect, say, "Yep, we think that this, and looks great," or "It doesn't," whatever it may be. But we're also going to pass that along to the interior designer that is the consultant for the owner, because they should also be getting their eyes on it. Again, I think that that's going to be very dependent based on your contract, but it that definitely is a slightly different way of working. But on larger projects, it can be really great. If I'm looking at fabric swatches for 200 different chairs in an office building, that's probably not going to be the best use of my time to sit there and say, does this one match that one? I'm going to be more looking at the door hardware. I would be thrilled to have an owner's consultant be able to take a much deeper look at that because they are probably also a little bit more passionate about that than at least I personally am.
Yeah, working with owner hired consultants is always a challenge, and I think it comes down to the owner definitely should be involved, just like Kat was saying. Um, Really, the difference is since you don't hold their contract, you can't hold them responsible for um, the timeliness of their submissions. You don't pay them, so you really need the owner to sort of push their buttons if they're being delinquent in things, and if that's having an impact on your project schedule. So I agree. The wording in the B101 is definitely confusing on that one. The keys there are that it talks about the owner has to coordinate the work of the owner hired consultant. That's like their schedule and fee, and that the architect coordinates with them, meaning so coordinate of versus coordinate with. And that just means, like Kat was saying, you incorporate their input into the contract document set in whatever way you all agree to do that. So that's it for today. And just a reminder that our next ARI Live will be on August 17th, and we'll be discussing building codes. You can go to go.blackspectacles.com/podcast to sign up, or check out the community page for this episode. Finally, please stick around for a few minutes after the broadcast to take our survey and share any suggestions you have for future episodes of ARI Live. I promise we read them all, and we use your feedback to make this podcast as helpful as it can be. Thanks for watching.